Andrew DiCecco covers the Eagles for 97.3 ESPN.com. Also, you catch them every Tuesday and Friday on the Football at 4 segment on the Sports Bash, powered by the Inside the Birds podcast. Andrew, how you doing on this Thursday?
Hey, Josh, doing well. Just trying to process all the information that's come out today.
Well, part of that information has to do with the Eagles. And I got to tell you, man, we're all looking forward to seeing the Eagles get back on the field, but it feels like this is just another example of this team can't get away from that injury bug. Andre Dillard, it looks like it's going to be season-ending surgery, torn right bicep.
Yeah, when you look at the Eagles' offensive line, what it was 2 months ago, you have Lane Johnson, Brandon Brooks, Jason Kelsey, Isaac Seumalo, and Andre Dillard. Fast forward 2 months later, now you have Lane Johnson, likely have Matt Pryor in there at right guard, Jason Kelsey, Isaac Seumalo, and Jason Peters moving back to his post at left tackle. I would argue that the offensive line is better with Jason Peters at left tackle, and that I do think that Matt Pryor will be just fine as a right guard. But that leaves the Eagles razor thin as far as depth is concerned. When you look at the names that they have, you have Jordan Mailata, who's been very inconsistent up and down. He's a guy that needs a lot of reps in order to get to where his potential can allow him to be. You have Nate Herbig, who hasn't played. You have Jack Driscoll, who's a rookie, and Sua Opeta and Prince Tega Manago. And there's just so many guys that, while they have potential, the Eagles aren't going to want to throw them out there in live action just yet.
So let's go part by part here, okay? So with Dillard being out, I know the assumption is Jason Peters would move to left tackle. Your opinion about Jason Peters at left tackle in 2020 is?
Well, I think the Eagles look very wise for bringing back Jason Peters, because obviously having a Jason Peters at 37 years old to play left tackle is better than a lot of left tackles currently in the league. So he'll be able to seamlessly slide in there. And last season he played at a high level, so you hope that he can kind of carry that over and at least give the Eagles one more season. Josh, you may actually need to give them one more season, because now the Dillard injury leaves the Eagles with a lot of questions. He's only played 4 games last year. Now he's missing an entire season. The team isn't really going to know where he's at in his development going into his 3rd season. So you really don't want to bank on that, his returning from injury and playing at the level that he's playing at right now. You don't want to bank on that going into the next season without having Jason Peters or a confident option in the fold.
Now, you mentioned a confident option. Obviously, part of that optionality is the situation with Jordan Mailata. I think people are hoping he would be the backup tackle coming into this year without no minicamps, no OTAs. It's just this training camp this month, and that's it. So, do you think that Mailata is going to be up to speed enough to be able to be that backup tackle in 2020?
I don't. I still think the Eagles would be hesitant to throw him out there to protect Carson Wentz's blind side. When you look at the players on the roster that really could have benefited from a preseason, you're looking at a guy, Jordan Mailata is a prime example of someone who would have benefited from more reps. The last 2 seasons he's been around in the NFL, he's ended his season on injured reserve. And, being a reserve player, he wasn't really getting many practice reps anyway. He looked good in the preseason when he was getting in a rhythm, getting out there, playing against guys. He played very well against Jacksonville last season in the preseason, going against their first team. But he pretty much had a year off, because he also began training camp on the COVID list. So his offseason was even more abbreviated than a lot of the players there. And he's a guy, like I said, that needs all the reps he can get in order to get be to the level that the Eagles expect him to be at. And he just hasn't had the consistency in training camp, going into with the season, 17 days away. He really hasn't shown enough that they can throw him out there and say, hey, you know what, you're going to protect Carson Wentz's blind side.
Andrew DiCecco joining us here on Game Night on 97.3 ESPN. Make sure to follow him on Twitter at @DiCecco NFL. So the assumption is then that if maybe as you're saying, he might not be the guy that you look at and say, I don't want to bring him in to protect Carson Wentz's blind side if Peters goes out. What do you think then that Howie Roseman, the Eagles, should do to maybe shore up some of these concerns?
Well, what I would do if I were Howie Roseman is I would look for a trade, look for a veteran lineman that might be on the fringe of making the roster or might be on the higher end of making a higher end salary that maybe might get dumped by a team late in the summer. Or you could look in free agency, and, I got to tell you, the names are very uninspiring. You have a lot of guys that are, veteran journeymen at this point, like TJ Clemens, and you have Jamarcus Webb and Jared Valdir, and just a lot of names of guys that have just been on 4 or 5 different teams and haven't really stuck any one place. And they're marginal players, and that's really what you're dealing with at this point in the summer. So, barring a trade, the options out there aren't very enticing.
So if that's the case, then what do the Eagles do moving forward? Because obviously, if there's no real enticing option out there and you're putting Jason Peters at left tackle and you're not sure about Mailata and, you're not really sure if you want to start Matt Pryor at right guard, what does the Eagles' 2020 season then look like, Andrew?
Well, it's going to be shaky. And, I think the short-term solution would be they could possibly claim somebody off waivers. You always see a veteran or two get kind of skimmed off the roster. So I do anticipate they need to bring a veteran in there for depth purposes and just to have that experience depth. And I think that they will get that. But, the offensive line as it currently stands, the starting unit is decent. It's okay. It's respectable. But, you get one nick and bruise or an injury, and all of a sudden you're really having to dive into the reserves there and bring in guys that haven't taken an NFL snap. It's going to be dire straits, and the Eagles need to pray for health in the trenches there, because it could get very, very ugly if any one of those guys has to miss time.
I've heard guys like Adam Kaplan and Jeff Mosher talk about multiple times on the Sports Bash on Football at 4 about how Howie Roseman does like to scour those waivers and those cuts when they come down in a couple of weeks. Could it be a situation where the Eagles just don't do anything at all and they might find a diamond in the rough? Because we know every year there's somebody who just doesn't make a 53-man roster, and half the NFL is like, well, that was surprising.
Yeah, on the Eagles roster right now, I don't see anybody that's ready to step in right now, but that's not to say that, the Patriots or the Raiders or any of those teams aren't going to kind of maybe discard somebody or part with them that they don't have room for, that maybe the Eagles had graded very high, or maybe there was an undrafted free agent that doesn't catch on that the Eagles really were pursuing, and all of a sudden they kind of shake free, and then all of a sudden they're in play. That's happened a lot. If you look at what the Eagles have done as far as waiver claims, when they set the initial 53-man roster, there's always a couple of little tinkerings that go on there, and they add a couple guys. So that's what I anticipate the Eagles doing. I don't foresee them standing pat with what they currently have.
Now, speaking of what they currently have, I want to ask you a specific guy who they currently have. That's Matt Pryor. Now, we've heard guys like Trey Thomas on the Sports Bash talk about how they believe that Matt Pryor showed in the little action that he had last year that he can play right guard and play it well. Do you share in that belief that Matt Pryor can play quality right guard this year?
Yeah, I agree with Trey. I did a film breakdown on Matt Pryor's game against Seattle for InsideTheBirds.com, and he showed a lot of encouraging signs for a young lineman. He only played 79 snaps. He's played less than 100 snaps in his NFL career. So it's a very brief snapshot, but an encouraging one at that. He moves very well. He got to the second level quickly. He anchors well. He's an athletic player, and he's long. He's one of the larger guards that you're going to see out there. I believe he goes about 6'7", 335 pounds, something like that. So he's surprisingly athletic for his size. So he does have some intriguing traits there. And I do think that I thought that they would have been fine with Matt Pryor at right guard before bringing Jason Peters back. So now I think that, the line as it stands right now is still in decent shape. But like I said, they're an injury away from being in some trouble.
Let me ask you about a couple other players on the team. Let's start on the offensive side. Jalen Reagor's get a lot of rave reviews in camp right now. So is it fair to believe the hype, or should we just hold out and be cautious?
Well, I think it's fair to be cautious and temper your expectations with any rookie, especially a wide receiver. That takes a little bit of time to get acclimated to an offense. But, like I've said on Sports Bash, I've had a chance to talk to Jalen Reagor's college offensive coordinator, Sonny Cumbie. One of the first things that out of his mouth, he was quick to praise him for his football intellect and his versatility. And the Eagles went into the offseason program thinking that they just wanted to teach him one position, and he grasped that so quickly that he started cross-training at other receiver positions and picked that up. And he's starting to form a good connection with the quarterbacks in camp and catch the ball well. And that's encouraging. That's what you want to see from your rookie first-round pick. And he's going to be a starter. He's been running with the ones. And he's a guy that you don't necessarily have to manufacture targets for. You don't have to force-feed him the ball because he's so athletic, and all you have to do is get him the ball in space, whether it be on jet motions, whether it be on screens, and take advantage of his ability to get yards after the catch or things like that. He's going to be a guy that's going to touch the football, and like I say, you don't have to force-feed him the football. That's going to come pretty naturally with his athleticism.
Flip it over to the defense. There's a couple of players I'm very interested in. I want to start with cornerback. I've heard multiple people now compliment Avante Maddox, and I've heard multiple people who cover the Eagles say this is a Avante Maddox job to win or lose. Andrew, to me, that's an incredible indictment of Sidney Jones. And I know Sidney's injured right now, but it feels like Sidney's always getting injured at this point. Ever since he tore his Achilles for the draft a couple of years ago, it feels like between the recovering from the Achilles and the hamstring issues, it feels like this guy just can't get right. And it's an incredible contrast with the guy who was supposed to be potentially the number one cornerback prospect in his draft. And then the next year, the Eagles get a guy, Avante Maddox, who everyone said was too small, weren't sure if he can cover in the NFL, and one guy is excelling and the other guy can't get on the field.
Yeah, I believe I wrote something for 97.3 before training camp that pretty much highlighted that battle, as you said. And I wrote that this is a make or break offseason for Sidney Jones because the team has given him a lot of chances, and he's been very inconsistent. He's been very up and down. Now he's 3 years removed from that Achilles injury, so that excuse isn't really going to fly anymore. He just has not been consistent enough or physical enough to put it all together. He doesn't look like the player that we saw at Washington, and he hasn't really ever taken that next step in his progression, whereas somebody like Maddox, who doesn't have all the athletic traits that maybe Sidney Jones has, he just keeps getting better, and he has that high football IQ, that FBI, and he's scrappy and he's physical and he's versatile. And he won that job running away. It wasn't even really a battle. He just that's his role, and he's going to be the number two. Now the question that I have becomes, what becomes of Sidney Jones? What do you do with him? Because you already have a lot of positions outlined. You have Slay, you have Maddox, you have your two nickel guys in Cravon LeBlanc and Nickel Roby-Coleman. Now the fifth cornerback position suddenly becomes Sidney Jones versus Rasul Douglas. Now what does Rasul Douglas do that Sidney Jones doesn't? He excels on special teams, and that's a vital role for a fifth corner. So what you could possibly see is if they don't have a plan for Sidney Jones, because he can't play on the slot, remember, he's just an outside corner, maybe they look to deal him at the end of the summer. I mean, if all else fails, they hold on to him and they keep six, and this is his last year in Philadelphia. But I really do think that it's run its course at this point, and I think there will be a team that might be willing to take a gamble on him for a late-round pick and take a flyer and hope to kind of revitalize Sidney's career.
The other thing with Rasul Douglas is, and again, I hate to bring this up again, but Douglas is on the field and Sidney isn't. And there's something to be said for the fact that, your availability is important in football. And I know the Eagles have had a rash of injuries over the last couple of years, but it's not like Rasul Douglas is the one who keeps having a hamstring issue like Sidney Jones does. At some point, you got to wonder, is it just as simple as one guy's available and one guy's not?
Yeah, I mean, it's a shame because Sidney Jones Rasul Douglas doesn't have the athletic ability of a Sidney Jones. Sidney Jones has the potential to be a top-tier corner. He just has not put it together in every opportunity they've given him. He's left injured. He hasn't played up to standard. He's played a little bit. He's played smaller than his size. It's just been very disappointing, and the Eagles haven't gotten significant return on their investment. And I think right now, like we were talking about, if you're the Eagles and you're sitting in that room and you're evaluating your guys, you have to have that conversation. what are we doing with Sidney? What's the plan for him? Because it's just not working out here. Maybe a change of scenery might be what Sidney needs, but it just hasn't come together for a multitude of reasons, and I think it's time to possibly move on from him.
The other position I want to hit on with you is defensive end. We know that Gerald Avery, according to reports, has a bone bruise for the knee, so he is week to week. But that defensive end situation is a bit of a quandary because after Brandon Graham and Vinny Curry, two known commodities, I mean, Avery's now injured. Derek Barnett's coming off an injury. Sharif Miller, I mean, they drafted him hoping that he can maybe pop. Joel Osman is coming off of an injury. He was a guy that was almost a lock to make the team last year. They drafted Casey Toohill. He's one of these motor guys that, he might not be the best athlete, but he's a guy who works hard. So, what do you think of this defensive end situation? Because, I mean, there's so many guys involved in who's going to be the main backups and who's going to be part of the rotation.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that Avery's missing time because he was obviously in the thick of things here with that fifth role. And, the fact that the Eagles gave up a fourth-round pick to get him gave him the upper hand. Now, the question now becomes what happens with how does the battle play out with Sharif Miller and Joe Osman and Casey Toohill? I have different takes on all these guys. I think Joe Osman is a guy that the Eagles really like. He's a high motor guy, an effort guy. Every team wants to have a Joe Osman on their roster. He's been around now this is his third training camp. He does things the right way. He's a great practice player. But when you move down the line, you gave up a fourth-round pick to get Sharif Miller. Now, I want to go on record by saying I was against that pick. I had him graded as a fifth-round pick, and I thought that with Charles Omenihu on the board, I thought the defensive lineman from Texas, I thought he would have been a better fit there. Now, he went on to have 3 sacks for the Houston Texans last year, and he's in their plans. Now, Sharif Miller didn't get on the field last season for the Eagles, and he has struggled with injuries this offseason. He didn't play in the scrimmage. So there's a lot of questions where he fits on the roster. The one guy that I really like out of that group, I've written about it for Inside the Birds, and Jeff mentioned it on the Inside the Birds podcast today, is I've been pretty high on Casey Toohill. I had a chance to see him at the East-West Shrine Bowl, and I was on one side of the field, and I'm watching the receivers, and I look over on the other side of the field, and I see this lineman just wreaking havoc on these offensive tackles, just making life miserable. And I walk over to get a closer look, and sure enough, it's Casey Toohill, who's completely undersized by comparison to these tackles, and he's relentless in his pass rush. He's a violent, aggressive pass rusher, has a really strong bull rush, and he found ways to get around the tackles. And like you were saying, he's not going to wow you with his athleticism, but it's his effort. And he's the type of guy that I can see him thriving on special teams in Philadelphia if he makes the team. He's had a great camp, and by all accounts, he's had a better camp than Jannard Avery, than Sharif Miller, and he's right up there with Joe Osman. So he's going to be a guy to keep an eye on in this next week.
Andrew, how many DNs should they keep, though? Because we know that they do play a lot of nickel. They don't play a lot of situations where they have a lot of linebackers. So is there a possibility that they just, say we're just going to not have a lot of linebackers on the roster and we don't want to lose too many of these guys on the D line and we're just going to beef up the D line and maybe have 5 or 6 DNs possibly?
Well, the way I kind of see it shaking out without really having done my 53-man roster breakdown yet, I kind of see it being, 5 defensive tackles, 5 defensive ends, and 5 linebackers. I think that 5 linebackers is the minimum they can get by with because you do need some for special teams purposes. Usually linebackers and reserve safeties make up the core of your special teams. And with TJ Edwards and Nathan Gary really being one of the core members last season, they'll be starters this year. You need to have a guy like an Alex Singleton or Sean Bradley and someone like that to really take the reins this season. Obviously, Duke Riley's going to have his hands full probably as the 3rd linebacker. So I think that 5 linebackers makes a lot of sense there. And you also have to remember the rosters expand to 55 guys this year. So you could see a scenario where they keep a guy like a Joe Osman or Casey Toohill or whoever on the practice squad, and they're able to kind of call him up as needed during the week. I think that you could see that could be a position where the Eagles look to take advantage of. Also, backup running back. They may only end up storing 3 and using a guy like Elijah Holyfield or a Mike Warren or an Adrian Killens to, as that midweek call up and kind of taking advantage of that 2+ roster.
Well, we know the roster is going to be morphing as we get closer to the NFL season. Of course, follow Andrew DiCecco on Twitter at @DiCecco NFL. Of course, you can hear him tomorrow on Football at 4 on the Sports Bash, powered by Inside the Birds podcast. As all guests, he appeared on game night here on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. Andrew, appreciate the time and the insights, and it feels like the Eagles news never stops.
Yeah, man, it never stops. And you got it, Josh. No problem.